Both. Okay, cool.
We would be able to see our beautiful face. So in terms of question, are we recording? Can we record this? We are recording now, and we will record the entirety of this presentation. And then the recording will actually be made available to everybody who is registered for the whole series. And there's lots of folks who are registered and be able to actually make it today. So you will be receiving a link to the recording in the follow-up email.
Have folks signed up for the Facebook secret group yet? There's like a link in the invitation.
Oh. Ooh. Don, I'll approve you right now.
I see you white noise collective. Are you rabble rousers?
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Toussaint.
Hi, Toussaint.
Hey, what's going on?
Hello.
Yo.
So much indivisible so coming much through.
Great. So exciting. So for all presenters, Mark, Toussaint, Manju, and Lydia, just a quick reminder that let's all keep ourselves muted unless we're talking. Thank you.
Toussaint, we've got folks coming through from New York, Oakland, Louisville, Purchase College, New York, Austin, Texas, Corvallis, Oregon, West Philly,
Maine,
Chicago,
all everywhere.
Danville, Kentucky,
Brooklyn in the house.
A lot of North Carolina. Yes, Brooklyn.
Boston.
I'm so happy to see the South so well represented.
Hey, Dana from Portland.
New Jersey.
Yeah, all the, we have War Sisters Leagues, all sorts of people. It's so exciting.
Yeah, y'all, you should know. I don't know if all of you folks who are coming in as participants are aware, but 100 people register for this series. So this is going to be pretty outstanding. In a minute, we'll do a little bit, once we hit the hour, we're going to do a little bit of an overview of just housekeeping so that you all understand how this is going to work and what your participation during the webinar can look like. So stay tuned for that.
Gaia from Vancouver, Canada.
Oh, hey, y'all.
There's a request from Ramona Gupta to post the link for the Facebook group.
Oh, okay.
Hey, Leanne from High Point, North Carolina, repping for an anti-racist white people contingent under Black Lives Matter Greensboro.
Nice.
Hi,
What's up, Annika?
Oh my God. Y'all are amazing. This is so beautiful. Lydia or Mark, I don't know if one of you would be able to post the Facebook link in the chat box. It also, just so everyone's aware, the link to the Facebook group is included in the email that you received a few days ago that had all of the pre-readings attached to it. So you can also pull up the email and click to it that way. Hi, Queer Spawn. So many of you. So beautiful. Discover in Connecticut. Hey, y'all. Thanks for being here.
I just chatted the link to the closed Facebook group for folks who are asking.
And we're international now because there's someone from BC.
Thank you. What? Love it. This is the sexiest webinar that's ever happened. I just want everyone to know that you're officially taking part in the sexiest thing that's happening right now on planet Earth.
Jill from Sassafras Tech Collective from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Ooh, we got ACLU in the house. What up there?
Line Break Media with storytellers and media producers.
Line Break, I love y'all. Oh, yay.
Yeah. Say open bookkeeping and
All right. Maybe, what do you think, Manju and Lydia? Should we give it like another minute or so and then I'll click us into the intro? Okay, 2 more minutes. We've got 180 people. Let's see if we get another 100 people in the next 2 minutes.
Our own Neely Jennings.
do you wanna? I'll just hold that, Jared.
Oh, Neely, I think you accidentally logged in as me. You're gonna have to both mute yourself and stop your video.
Okay.
But we love seeing your face. That's totally fine. Oh, Center for Family Life is in the house. Thank you for being here, Rachel.
Crystal is asking, she says, I don't see my mute or video options. Are participants auto-muted?
You are
Yes.
auto muted, and you are, yeah, we will have we'll run through this in a bit, but there will be an opportunity for you to raise hands at one point. So we'll talk through that right when we get started.
Welcome, Louisa from Denver, Zaleh Afshar from Center for Social Inclusion from New York, Nell from Madison, Wisconsin.
Hi, Sasha.
Shout out to Doris from Washington, Bruce from Louisville, Sasha, New York City, Mariana in Los Angeles, Sarah from Portland.
Beautiful. Well, we're about 5 minutes in, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Wow, amazing moment. Thank you all for being here. My name is Autumn. I'm with the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a deeper intro to aorta in a second. But right now I'm just gonna give you an overview of what's about to happen. This amazing thing that's about to go down. So excited. We're going to spend the first part of this webinar just giving you a little bit of an introduction to aorta, to who we are as presenters. And then we're gonna do some work that's around just giving context for why we're doing this series, and what's sort of happening in this political moment that prompted us to want to bring this political education into more of a national / North American space. And then we're going to do a deep dive on divide and conquer strategy and tactics. We're going to give you some definitions. We're going to talk through some of the tactics of divide and conquer strategies. And then we're going to do some storytelling. We've got some amazing guests that we're going to introduce later in the hour who are going to tell us some stories from movement history. So just get ready, it's about to be amazing. And then there'll be an opportunity for some actual discussion, some conversation that will happen between us and our guest storytellers. And also we're going to be able to field questions from all of you who are participating and get some of your questions answered. And so that's where we're going to have some participatory stuff. And then at the end, we're going to do a teaser on some of the content that's going to be coming your way over the course of the rest of the series and let you know where we're headed. As you already know, this webinar is the first of a 3-part series. So the theme of this webinar is Understanding Divide and Conquer. The next webinar that's going to happen at the end of April will be on understanding this moment. And then the theme of our 3rd webinar in this series is alliance. So it's going to look at what are effective strategies for coalition building and alliance building, and building authentic partnerships and relationships in the time. And throughout that whole process, you're going to continue to receive pre-readings, post-readings, resources. We're talking about even doing like a Facebook Live event in the Facebook group where we can workshop some of the issues that we're currently facing in our own local organizing work. So we're thinking about all the different ways that we can help folks be engaged through this process. Little bit of housekeeping. So as you can probably see on your screen, there's 2 different options for how you can put your voice into the space of the webinar. And one is this chat. So you click on the chat box, open it up, and then you can write into it. You have the option to write a chat that's to everyone, but you can also click on this little blue bubble and they'll give you a drop-down menu if you want to send a chat privately to one of the panelists. I believe that that's how it will work on your end. There's another box that says Q&A, and that's where we'll get to the point where we ask you if you questions that you want to ask of our presenters, our storytellers. When we get to that point, we'll let you know to start putting your questions into the Q&A box, and then a couple of us will be curating people's questions and then bringing them forward. So there's a couple of different ways to be able to put your voice in. And so hopefully you'll be able to sort of be in that ongoing conversation in the chat box, but also ask really specific questions through the Q&A. Otherwise, you are all muted and your video is not showing. So you can feel free to like go to the bathroom or do whatever you need to do and carry the computer with you. If you need to do that, no one's gonna know. That's what's so great about a webinar. We know that webinars can feel kind of like stuffy and weird, and that's not what we're going for here. So we're gonna just keep being ourselves, and we encourage you to just show up however you're gonna show up right now. All right, here we go.
Great. So welcome again from AORTA. For those of you who don't know, AORTA stands for the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. We are a worker cooperative, which means we are collectively owned by us, and we do work to strengthen movements for social justice and the solidarity economy. We are a multiracial, multi-gendered, wonderful group of people. We are across the U.S., so there are folks in California, and North Carolina, and Philly, and Minnesota. I'm in New Orleans, someone's in Vermont. We are all over the country, and we really believe that our work is about expanding the capacities of social justice movements and solidarity economies so we can create the world that we really need to not just survive, but to thrive. And so sometimes that looks like workshops, sometimes that looks like trainings, sometimes that looks like ongoing consultations, but we're really invested in building up our movement's infrastructure and our capacities to both understand broad-based political analyses about how power and oppression works, as well as how that links into some of the nuts and bolts work of conflict resolution, strategic planning, all over there. We work with lots of types of groups of people. Some folks who are here today we've worked with, like I see people at the Southern Maine Worker Center who we've gotten to work with over a number of years, the Center for Family Life, so worker co-ops, immigrant-run things, universities, big nonprofits, sometimes more on the social service end, but really trying to do that work from a place of thinking about social change, cultural organizing groups, a whole kind of range of people doing the work of racial, economic, environmental, gender justice work in our world. So that's a little bit about who we are and how we do it. And that really grounding our political analysis is that we base our work in an intersectional approach to liberation, because we believe that that's what is needed to uproot all systems of oppression, really in this vision of a collective liberation framework. So we don't believe in oppression Olympics. We don't think it's productive or useful to argue about, for instance, if racism or sexism is more important, but we do believe that we need to be always taking on systems of oppression head on and how they intersect together in order so that we're able to get the most people free, which is kind of our real grounding vision. And you will see shapes the way we're going to be approaching this webinar series and our work. If you have more questions about it, for folks who missed the first thing, you can always learn more about us at aorta.coop, aorta.coop. And also, so who are we? So I'm Lydia Palo Hobbs, and I'm coming to you from New Orleans, Louisiana. It's a rainy day, so if at any point I dip out, my power might have gone out. I will get back on as soon as I can via my phone, but that's the deal here. Other folks from Aorta.
I'm Autumn Brown. I am coming to you from rural Minnesota, rural central Minnesota, which means my internet is also a little special. I don't have the rain to blame living fully.
My name is Manju Rajendran, and I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina. And one thing that's special about today, besides getting to share this incredible space with you all, is that a year ago, I gave birth to my daughter, Azadi Asha Karim. So I'm really excited to be celebrating with you by building a world that the next generation deserves.
Hey, I'm Mark, and I'm here in Berkeley, California. I'm mostly on a back seat today. I'm just trying to field questions coming in for you all, and I'll be participating later in the webinar series more, but I'm excited to be here.
So there were a few readings that we sent out, and there's absolutely no guilt or sadness if you were not able to get to it yet. We're going to just breeze through some of the stuff about the readings, and for those of you who haven't gotten a chance yet, it'll be a teaser to tempt you to get back in the mix and read these things. One of the pieces that we worked with was the Combahee River Collective Statement, written in 1977 by an incredible crew of Black, lesbian, socialist visionaries. And on the question of intersectionality, they said, we see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. We also often find it difficult to separate race from class from sex oppression because in our lives, they are most often experienced simultaneously. And some of these ideas, when you're hearing them today, might feel like, wait, we think about that all the time. That's obvious, but it wasn't obvious yet. And really their articulation was what paved the path for us who talk about intersectionality today to be so clear about these ideas. On the question of Black Lives Matter, they said, above all else, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and our work. And they named so powerfully how when Black Lives Matter, it makes it possible for all of us to have stronger liberation movements. On the question of identity politics, they said this focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So this is an interesting pushback against some of the kind of tearing down of an identity-centered politics that we've been hearing of late. And we see this as a tool in the process of resisting divide and rule. Our sisters from the Combahee River Collective Statement said, on resisting divide and rule, they said, we struggle together with Black men against racism, while we also struggle with Black men about sexism. We realize that the liberation of all oppressed people necessitates the destruction of the political, economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. So not one at a time, but all at once. We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work. We need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working and economic lives. And they named challenges as opportunities. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And this names for us how critical challenging anti-Black racism and challenging the sexism that particularly harms Black women as crucial in a sort of like ripple effect transformation of our world. They named liberation as a process. In the practice of our politics, we do not believe that the end always justifies the means. We believe in collective process and a non-hierarchical distribution of power within our own group and in our vision of a revolutionary society. So when they gathered at their kitchen table, it was like a kind of prefigurative practice, like a sort of practicing the world that they wanted to build. And we can do that too.
Great. So the other piece that was sent out that you may or may not have read was this really phenomenal piece by Linda Burnham. No plans to abandon our freedom dreams, which was something that was written in just the first few weeks of the Trump administration. So if we fast forward a little bit to our current political moment and where we find ourselves today, we want to take a moment to tease some of the like really juicy bits of that piece out. And some of the really critical thinking that she has been doing. So one of the first things she names is that we are in currently a moment of three simultaneous crises. We're in a crisis of the working class, we're in the crisis of the ruling class, and we're in a crisis of the state. When we say crisis, we mean that we're in a moment that the current organization of society, the current social relations are actually no longer able to be reproduced. Something new has to happen. It's no longer working. And so I want to break that down just a bit, right? So this crisis in the working class, as she talks about it, is a real deep fragmentation that's occurred around lines of race, gender, citizenship, region, age, which is not new, right? But has been more intensely worked to be fragmented as a leverage point for things such as divide and conquer, which we'll be talking about in a deeper way in these critical times. That there's a real crisis in the ruling class, or like the elites of the world, right? Which is really a question of what is the best way to go forward at this time in pursuit of maintaining racial capitalism. So like there's actually a real debate of like within at the really big sphere, are we thinking about a way to maintain the neoliberal project, which has really undermined actually most pursuits of freedom, or is the goal towards this more proto-fascist version that will, and that both of these options that are getting debated by folks way above us, right? Neither of those are great options for us, but it's noteworthy that that fight is happening at that level of society right now as well. And that there is a crisis within this state. And when I say that there's a crisis within the state, and what she talks about is that we're seeing this deep moment of profound state realignment. So how the government is structured, where are resources being funneled, where are they being disinvested from? But what's really deep about this moment is our state is much larger at the federal level than it was 40 years ago, than it was 100 years ago. So there's actually these deep reserves within itself, right, of state bureaucrats pushing back at the same time, which is creating these really complicated splintering processes for the Trump administration to move as quickly at times as they would like. They're moving very fast, but there's these layers that are going on as well that are worth noting and paying attention to. And so the question still remains, how quickly can the Trump administration reorder, and what are our possibilities of pushing back for a different type of reordering? And so if we're in this moment of crisis, there's been a lot of debates by pundits and politicians and activists and academics about how we got here, right? And that a really dominant narrative that's emerged has been that the problem is identity politics. And so we are hearing this a lot from members of the liberal elites, right? Who really have been arguing that actually it's been through focusing on issues such as racism, sexism, xenophobia, right, that we ended up here, because it was through that process that the Democratic Party, quote unquote, lost the white worker. And that what we need is the Democratic Party to return to a race and gender neutral and an immigration neutral politic of an economic program that really is going to help everyone, and that's going to get white working class people back on the train of the Democrats. And that this is just, as Linda Burnham notes, she's like, this is just not accurate, this analysis. It's not only simplistic, it's dangerous. And it's also really offensive, because we know, right, actually, that there has not been a Democratic Party commitment to working class people's lives for a very, very, very long time, if there ever was. And that's like something, and the times that it has been was only because of profound organizing by labor. And so that's something that's worth noting. But even more than that, it's actually been through such quote unquote identity politics and the simplistic rendering of them that are racist, what Manju was just articulating with Combahee, that so much greater possibilities for freedom have been born. And we can see that in just the most visible manifestation of the long history of the Black freedom struggle, right? So that it was via the abolitionist movements in the 1800s, right, that really gave space to a burgeoning feminist and labor movement. That we can see that it was, it's been actually through things such as Black Lives Matter that are really deeper, more expansive vision of what is possible, or what are we actually asking the world to look like? How do we actually get out of this trap of thinking that policing in cages makes us safer, to like really push out and think in a much broader direction. And so that in fact, rather than being narrow demands, they're actually demands that are quite expansive in their possibilities. And that it also fails to acknowledge really actually the central role that race has played in the development of the US, and that we can't actually ever separate conversations of race from class, because they've never been separated in the development of the United States of America. And that goes from land theft and genocide to enslavement of Black folks, right, to Africans who were then made into Black people, into the processes of like the first immigration exclusions being racial projects against Asians. And so how do we keep all of that history in line to understand how we got here? So that's a huge thing that I think this is so juicy that we could get into forever. And I want to just also name a couple other points that she talks about quickly, which is how much this has pivoted also in this conversation that somehow we need to get back to the national interest. And she names so clearly for us that the national interest, there has never been one singular national interest. And the positing of it as such is to recenter and rename this supposed kind of white, often male, particular kind of class background person, as that is what is the national interest as a whole, which implicitly says that other people's interests, if interests are always politicized, are not as important, are not as authentic, and are not actually the goals. And while that has been true historically, right, we push back against that as a continual frame, because that's actually part of how we got here to begin with. And that at the end, she really clearly says, like, this is not to say we don't care, right, about actually the devastations that are happening in white working class communities. The opiate epidemic is real, right? The failure of white rural communities to continue and reproduce themselves is deep and profound, but that this is one piece of the broader failures of neoliberal capitalism. And so it's just as important for us to be thinking about how that piece links in, for instance, with the uptick of immigration raids under President Obama. We also need to think about that in the same way of women of color having a hard time getting access to reproductive health care, right? That these pieces are, we need to be thinking in a race and gendered manner so we can actually articulate what are all the different ways in which people are being exploited, disposed of, having state-sanctioned violence against them, and that is going to be the way that we're going to bring ourselves to a more better understanding of how we got here and what it's going to take to get us out of this mess to begin with.
Thanks for breaking that down so hard, Lydia.
Mm-hmm.
So into the chat box, if you could type, what do you see as connections between the two powerful writings that we read for homework? And what would you say are some of the key questions and conditions that we're still struggling with that were shouted out in the Combahee River Collective? I'm hearing Amory Ballantyne say when you're talking about the co-optation of identity politics, can you also talk about the ahistorical and asystemic reframing of racism, sexism, et cetera, as something that white men can be targets of, such as these whack ideas like reverse racism or affirmative action is racist, or that kind of alt-right point of view that's getting mainstreamed? And you got a yes from Susie Hofstrader.
Right. And I think that, because at the end of the day, right, it's this really, the deletion of any form of power analysis, right? All of these ideas, right, assume, right, that actually reparations for past harms is somehow a special project rather than actually something that we're really working to undo and redo, because actually people opportunities have been stolen, right? And so I think that like so much of this narrative that we see from the alt-right, right, to, I would say, a lot of the liberal center, right, completely fails to think about power in any systematic way. And that is going to be that's continually getting mobilized, right, because people are having to change the way they exist in the world. I'm thinking about this, right, like people having to like actually understand how gender operates on a spectrum that is not so easy and not binary. And that instead of actually recognizing that people's having to do some learning around that, right, that is getting totally erased instead of a deeper analysis of how, right, trans and non-binary people had been targets of violence and unable to live their full lives over and over and over again.
Absolutely. I'm hearing in the chat box from Miriam, connections I see between the two writings are the certainty in both writings that the personal is political and it's inclusive. Thomas quotes from Freedom Dreams, "It's never a good idea to enter willingly into a frame that your opponent has constructed to entrap you." John names connections, common issues across a 2-generation time span. One question is, why has so little changed despite so much effort? My God, yes. And Emery gives these examples of this problematic co-optation of identity politics, like Richard Spencer talking about needing safe space, or Milo calling himself a victim. I hear the long story of the leadership of marginalized people and communities in protecting and preserving that which is crucial to the survival and freedom of all of us. Where would we be without this long leadership? Yeah, so Black feminist socialist thinkers have articulated this analysis over time of how the system pits us against each other and how little has changed in the tactics of the system over time. Next.
Yeah, there's this piece in here can you speak to the intersectionality framework of Combahee and relative to how the term is being manipulated and reframed? And I think this is something that the right consistently does. And Linda references this in our article. She talks about how, in some words that are assigned to the left that don't come from the left, like politically correct, right? But the identity politics and just that like Lydia said, there's no analysis of power within that framework. That this is just purely about looking like a Benetton advertisement, like we were the superficial type of identity without addressing the fundamental power issues that are embedded in the United States. And I think, like, in this moment, we really need to be built. The tension that I'm seeing is that people are feeling as well. In these moments, we need to build relationships that extend beyond our usual limits. And then that appears to be in contradiction, right, with, what Combahee say, we need to articulate the real class situation of people who are not merely raceless, sexist workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working lives, right? But building beyond our limits is not, as Linda says, it's not about it's not an argument against addressing the economic anxieties of white workers. It's an argument for addressing those concerns as a component of a larger story about the declining fortunes of a class as a whole, and refusing to make concessions to racism, heterosexism, xenophobia, Christian supremacy, and misogyny, while addressing those concerns. And for me, that's where I'm excited to learn from the history stories here. How are people centering those politics and centering the people most affected by that in a way that creates ripples outwards, like a pebble in a pond, creating ripples that lift up all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the ways that we've been talking about it. Go ahead, Autumn.
Well, I just wanted to add in too that I think one of the beautiful things that both pieces of writing lift up is just the sort of where is the lie in the narrative that's being told, and particularly the narrative of the national interest and as being defined as a common interest, when we know that part of the racial capitalist project was really a destruction of the commons, right? That there cannot be a national interest in the context of a capitalist project in which we don't actually have a sense of the commons, and we're not even allowed to. And so I think that that's this interesting piece that I think we're going to loop back to in future webinars about how do we, what are the sort of strategies that we can use to rebuild a sense of a commons? What are the economic strategies, but also what are the political and campaign strategies that we can, where we can tie back to a sense of an actual common interest?
I'm seeing a lot of stuff coming up here, which I think are all so great. Okay, great. I maybe we should move along. Sorry, I'm getting really excited, but I'm realizing time.
I'm loving all the brilliance that people are putting into the chat box. This is like super solid stuff. It's important to read in Burnham's piece about the wrong tendency on the left too, to try to create hierarchies of oppression. When economic oppression gets posited as the overarching problem, race gets totally flattened and explained away in a totally silencing way. Autumn, our DJ, may I suggest that we fast forward to Koya and Lydia's stories, and then we'll zoom back to Brother Malcolm.
We should not do my story.
No, let's do your story, please.
Let's do all the stories.
So Toussaint is, Toussaint, are you here? Do we still have you? Fabulous, I see you, I hear you. Toussaint is a brilliant, visionary organizer and scholar. His day hustle is he's an assistant professor in the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and his research focused on grassroots responses to the post-war emergence of mass incarceration in Chicago. Currently, he teaches on African American history, Black politics, criminal justice policy, and transnational social movements. Lydia and I got tight with him through Left Turn Collective and through Chicago Soccer for Justice. He is co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement with Dan Berger, and he's currently working on a book titled War for the City, Black Chicago and the Rise of the Carceral State. So welcome, Toussaint. If you could please tell us a story of Bacon's Rebellion.
Okay, good afternoon, or I'm assuming, well, I guess good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to use the opportunity that I have to really kind of sketch out a history that might be useful in terms of how we think about really these questions of moving past sort of sort of our oppressors' strategies of divide and conquer, and really find ways to organize and to unify amongst each other, alongside each other. And one of the, I think, examples that really strikes out in our history is that of Bacon's Rebellion, and I think it's instructive in some ways to think about this history as something that can kind of guide us in terms of how we address some of the ways in which we work together in the present moment. I guess in the thumbnail sketch that I want to give to just kind of outline things is Bacon's Rebellion is a kind of political movement that occurs in 1676, so about 100 years before the American War of Independence begins. And it's generally looked at as this sort of moment where kind of working class folks across the sort of colonial Virginia came together to challenge the sort of aristocratic landowners, slave owners, and for a brief moment, potentially, had an opportunity to see state power and kind of thwart or change the direction that the sort of early British North American colonies were going in. And if you read historians like Howard Zinn, you'll get a sense of Bacon's Rebellion as this kind of moment of kind of anti-elite, kind of like multiracial struggle that occurred. And one of the ways in which kind of Bacon's Rebellion and the history of it has kind of come back into common knowledge, one of the ways I first learned about it was by reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And she talks about it as being a formative moment where the idea of racial caste and really a race-based system of slavery emerges. And that comes in part out of the sort of response of kind of the colonial governor and his allies to really the kind of profound threat to their control of kind of colonial government that Bacon's Rebellion posed. I mean, here you have a kind of colony that's got about 40,000 people in it, and from their own estimations, from the estimations of the kind of colonial governor and his allies, about really 7, 8 out of 10 people in colonial Virginia were on the side of Bacon's Rebellion and were willing to throw down and challenge the colonial policies and potentially kind of overthrow the sort of England's kind of installed governor, colonial governor at the time. And after kind of putting down the rebellion, one of the things that Michelle Alexander notes is that those in power, the colonial governor and what have you, responded in a couple different ways to the threat of the rebellion. One of the things that they did is that they relied less heavily on bringing to the colony white indentured servants, because one of the things that Bacon's Rebellion had been able to do was kind of really draw a fair amount of support from this population of white indentured servants who were especially when the rebellion occurred in 1676, in pretty dire circumstances. And instead of relying on white indentured servants, really turned towards relying on enslaved Africans as the main labor force for colonial Virginia, both those who would be growing corn crops for just basic provisions for the population as a whole, and also tobacco, which was the main export of the colony. And they also shifted from really using enslaved Africans who had already had some interaction with Europeans and the colonial West Indies, and focused more directly on importing enslaved Africans directly from West and Central Africa. So really shifting the kind of population of folks who would make up the kind of the whole of those who were in bondage in colonial Virginia, mainly because they were seen as being less in a more would have a more difficult time being able to build alliances with white indentured servants in the same way that occurred during the course of Bacon's Rebellion. And crucially, what Michelle Alexander suggests is that in addition to trying to really shift the demographics of the labor force and the class of those who were in bondage who made colonial Virginia run, that there was also the development of what she terms the racial bride, where white free laborers and in some instances a dwindling population of indentured servants were given opportunities to one, not find themselves in competition with enslaved Africans, and two, be able to work as, be able to serve on slave patrols, be able to gain greater access to land that was controlled by Native Americans, and basically rise within the kind of the social hierarchy of colonial Virginia, so that ultimately they found themselves in a slightly privileged position. They might still be poor, that might still be less, have a difficult time raising their crops and being able to kind of progress in general, but at least they were not enslaved. And Alexander and other scholars really point to this moment as one in which we really start to see a hardening of the idea that slavery is not just a system of bondage, but it's one that's tightly connected to a conception of race that is linked to Blackness. And so you have the idea of kind of a heritable, like enslavement as a heritable trait that can be passed down from a mother to a child. And that it's really kind of in this moment in response to the potential of alliances between white and Black working people, whether they be free or they be in bondage, that you have the emergence of a system of what Michelle Alexander terms racial caste, and that system of racial caste is one that lives with us to this day and is very much predicated on preventing alliances between Blacks and whites, and really people of color as a whole, in response to the oppression that they find themselves contending with by those who are in positions of power. One last point.
Tuz, can I pause you right there?
Yes.
Can we save that last point?
One last point is that,
okay.
To get to the last point, and it's really important, is that I think one of the things that Michelle Alexander kind of leaves out is that fundamental to the agenda of Bacon's Rebellion and the goals that those who were involved sought was, and this is especially with Nathaniel Bacon and many of those who were kind of his lieutenants, was really stealing land from Native Americans. And the only really point of difference between Bacon and the colonial governor at the time was over whether they would be really trying to steal land from and essentially exterminate all Native Americans, or whether that would only be done with those who were kind of clearly defined or explicitly defined as enemies and not sort of allied or friendly Native American nations. And that this question of accessing and really accessing land and expanding the scope of the colonial settlement was very much at the heart of what took place during the course of Bacon's Rebellion, particularly for those who were in kind of a leadership position of it. And that demand for increased settlement and continuing to push forward a policy of both really a genocidal policy against Native Americans and efforts to kind of expropriate their land is also one of the dangers of grounding multiracial alliances on a foundation that is still relies on a logic of settler colonialism. And so as much as there's, I think, important things to learn from, say, what Michelle Alexander, and in some instances what Howard Zinn puts forward, that the context of kind of the settler dynamics that really framed and grounded what was taking place during the course of Bacon's Rebellion should not be left out as well, too.
Thank you so much. Koya, I will skip your introduction and let you just dive into talking about Standing Rock, because I know you've got a dip.
Hey, and now I'm curious about what my introduction was. But hi, my name is Koya Whitehead Artichoker. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm actually in Seattle right now. But I was asked to talk about sort of divide and conquer tactics as it relates to some of the work that happened at Standing Rock. And it was interesting when you asked me the question to think about it, because I think there were a lot of places where there was some fracturing that occurred, and I think had the sort of standoff gone on longer, you would have seen more of that come to light. But I think one of the bigger things that, for me, that I keep talking about with regards to Standing Rock and the resistance that happened there is really a much bigger question for me around what are our values? What do we value as movements? And what are we grounded in? So for me, the movement at Standing Rock was very spiritually based. And I think that was the place of divide and conquer, was that you saw a lot of conflict between folks around tactics and strategy as it relates to our cultural values and our spiritual values, because it was such a spiritually based camp. There was prayers every morning, there were water ceremonies every morning, the elders were consistently consulted on how to move forward, and there were ceremony, people went to ceremony to ask for guidance. And so a lot of what you saw happening in the camp was a divide between those who wanted to keep it spiritually based and traditional, and those who wanted to engage and use more sort of confrontational tactics. So the standoffs that you saw happening, the night with the water, when the people were sprayed with water, or even the dogs, there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not those tactics were appropriate. Because, as spiritual people, as traditional folks, it's very important to us to stay grounded and to have something come from from a good place in our hearts. And so I saw it very much as a conflict between really old school ways of thinking and really modern ways of resisting. And these things are not, modern resistance and, is not something that our people are really comfortable with. It's not, we don't think of ourselves as activists. I think that people often think that we're some kind of activist people, when in reality we do things like Standing Rock because it's part of our spiritual mandate. It's part of who we are as a people, and it's part of our dedication to the planet, right, and to the future generations. So a lot of the conflict that happened there had more to do with, do we continue to confront Morton County Sheriff, or do we stay in prayer and, sort of not confront them in some of the ways that were happening. So I think that's kind of, for me, a bigger question that we should be thinking about across movements as a whole, is what are we grounding ourselves in? What are our values? What are our guiding principles? How are we being led by our elders, or how are we not being led by our elders? And I think it's a real strategy question too. I think I was really grateful for the spiritual aspect to Standing Rock, because I felt like it really provided our young people with an example and a model of what they could do in the future, and of how powerful their people are. So I think, the sort of back and forth that occurred there and the questions around tactics and strategies are important to sort of interrogate in a much bigger sense, not only as it relates to the historical context of the US, which neither, I appreciate both of those articles, but I think continues to be some sort of native erasure within those as well, because we are always on stolen land. That we're never going to get away from that. So until people can sort of come to terms with that piece of it and build that into their narrative, because that's what Standing Rock was also all about. We're continuing to feed into native erasure. So I just want to make that point as well.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. Koya, real quick, do you feel like there was a deliberate wedge placed at that potential fracture between the old ways and modern resistance? Did it feel like Morton Sheriff's Department was aware that there were different strategic perspectives and were trying to like play on that?
Yeah, I do. I think they were aware of that. The day that, I don't know if people were following, but there was one day where a man, they were also infiltrators. You know, that was one of the things that was common there, was that if you saw somebody who was sort of intentionally seeking to create problems or cause problems or create some sense of chaos, people would immediately think that it was an infiltrator. And so one day a man was trying to go to the camp, and he was driving a white pickup truck. And there are photos on Facebook of this. They ran him off the road, and he went into the river, and he had like a AK-47 or an automatic assault rifle. He was a native man. It was a native dude who was hired by Energy Partners, and he was dressed like the other protesters, dressed like the water protectors, and his intention was to go into camp and to possibly shoot someone. The BIA arrested him and then took him, and I don't know if any charges were ever filed against him, but so there was very much an attempt by not only the Morton County Sheriffs, but I would say actually the private companies that were hired to protect the private security. They were the ones who were engaging in a lot of intentional sort of infiltrators and trying to get people to sort of do those sort of in-your-face confrontational tactics, right? Which again are not, I don't think are traditional to our people. I think our people fought wars when they had to fight wars. But I know it was uncomfortable for folks to think about being confrontational in that kind of way, and that if they felt like it was unsafe, right? Because most of the water protectors were unarmed, but Morton County Sheriff was armed, and so was the security. So it was often a real question of safety too.
Damn, thank you. Thank you so much for that powerful storytelling. And we know you got a roll, Koya, but thank you for squeezing us into your super busy day. We're gonna ask Lydia Palo-Hobbs to—
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, love.
Yep.
Lydia lives in New Orleans, and she is a founding member of AORTA, and she has been involved in organizing on the ground to support a just recovery post-Katrina, post-Rita. Lydia is also an incredible scholar doing a lot of dope research around prison abolition. So Lydia, take it away.
Yeah, hi. So I'm going to do a really quick story that I think is a really positive story about a moment that there could have really been divide and conquer, and then that was able to hold and not actually be the case for a really big win. So in New Orleans, as I assume everyone knows, New Orleans, right, flooded 80% of the city when the levees broke following Hurricane Katrina. What also happened in that moment was the mass flooding of the city jail, Orleans Parish Prison, where no one had been evacuated. People were left to die. Really courageous individuals saved each other in the floodwaters while the sheriff's department abandoned them full scale. So there was a lot of actually outcry around in the national media around the flooding of OPP, which is what we call our city jail. And in the years that followed, as FEMA money came in kind of late to the scene, was the announcement of FEMA funds, $270 million to redevelop the city jail. If anyone has ever been involved in any struggles around a jail, a sheriff hears that there's going to be some money for a jail, and the sheriff starts thinking about how many more beds he can add on. OPP had grown expansively to 7,500 beds, which is larger than the largest prison in Louisiana, Angola, by the time the Katrina hit. The damage that had been done during the flood had required a shrinking down to about 5,000-ish beds. About 5,000 beds. And so when there was this money on the table, there had been lots of different organizing. So the money shows up around 2009, or the debates around how that money is going to get funneled. And so the sheriff pushes for an expanded jail as what New Orleans needs to be safe. And that really appeared to be the winnable argument at the time. But on the other side, there was a building up of a reformation of something called the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition, which it was actually a pre-Katrina organization that had been dormant in the first few years right after the storm. And OPPRC reforms really before there was the immediate announcement of the FEMA funds, but really moves into action. And what's really notable in that moment is that the divide that was able to not be conquered was actually able to find some ideological commitment, unity, or not ideological unity, was able to surpass some ideological differences towards this bigger fight, was really this coming together of a broad-based group of people, some who really identified as prison reformers, whose goal was to get, who were not actually against the idea of incarceration, to really explicit prison abolitionists, and lots of people in between who were able to come together. And so this group of people that often have been used as a wedge, right, has been around this like debate of reform versus abolition, and that this group of people were able to come together to really hold a politic. So instead of getting of abolitionist reforms, or the idea that there are ways to shrink the prison system, right, through reforms that also calls attention to the inherent violence of the system that will hopefully be a stepping point for even larger shrinkages. So over a number of years, and I would say that this was able to be held, and when I say big groups of people, I'm talking about big policy people like the Vera Institute. I'm talking about religious folks, so people who kind of were in the social justice Catholic tradition. I'm talking about people who had worked with kind of more like mainstream nonprofits like Southern Poverty Law Center or the Innocence Project, to organizations that were much more grassroots, like Voice of the Experiences, which organizes formerly incarcerated people in New Orleans, or Critical Resistance's chapter that is explicitly an abolitionist organization, to immigrant justice organizations who were really seeing the relationship of ICE holds to jail expansion, and a lot of other folks in between, right? And one of the things that became really critical together was actually abolitionists really holding a strong politic around consensus decision-making, right? Who had too many times seen reformers who tend to have a lot more access to resources being able to hold power in a way, and abolitionists saying we need to be actually all on the same team in figuring this out together. And we know there's going to be trying to be backroom deals for those who are used to wearing business suits and having, you know, these like policy meetings with city council members to go do that. And then we're going to find out like 6 months later that y'all were doing that. Like, we actually need to really be a coalition, not just in name, but in real politic. And so we're able to actually create really collective decision-making structures that undermine the ability of city council members or the sheriff's office to peel people off, as they historically had been able to do. And on the other side, we're able to, but also we're able to say, okay, policy folks, like what do you have access to? And did a lot of they used a lot of research to talk about how huge the jail was compared to cities of similar sizes in New Orleans. So how it already was too large, and so the idea of expanding it was a monstrosity. And we're able to argue down to arguing that 1,548 beds is where the jail should be. Not because they thought anyone should be jailed, but because they also named that, but that so many of the people being locked up were actually also being locked up as state prisoners who were getting held in a jail system, which has been a long part of Louisiana's prison expansion project. And that actually getting state prisoners out would have this ability to both shrink the state prison population on a statewide scale, right? Because there are less beds for them, and to shrink the amount of people that were funneling through the jail system. And so judges would implicitly often be giving people different types of sentences. They were able to really organize also the media, which had already had so much outrage right after Katrina, but to then go back years later and to organize media and make their own media through to talk about things such as the sheriff's office having a per diem system where there were financial incentives for locking more people up, to talk about how jails don't make anyone safer, that New Orleans crime rates have been going down, right? To do all of this really like work that was really about creating a different public narrative in the face of the beginnings of a really deep conversation of New Orleans and Louisiana as the most incarcerated places per capita in the world. So to be able to be waging a struggle really on that grounds, that like that is not a title that anyone likes to have. And we're able to really build a public discourse where the papers that had historically been pro-jail, pro-prison were all of a sudden writing different types of editorials, right? And at the same time holding the stories of formerly incarcerated people and people whose families are directly targeted for policing incarceration at the center. So when there weren't going to be public meetings that held those spaces, OPPRC held public meetings to put those voices front and center. So it could not just be a conversation of numbers, but of really building out a conversation of this is actually how you steal people's lives from them. And this is not something that we're invested in, which led to, in 2010, City Council voting unanimously for a shrunk bed count. So the city jail over a few years went from 7,500 beds to 1,548 beds, which is
massive
wild.
victory. Incredible.
And the sheriff's office continues to try to plug and get that number up and up and up and up, right? Like it also wasn't an end, but it was a critical shift. Both in how many people could get locked up in New Orleans, but also in having a bigger conversation about what type of city we actually want to be.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A round of virtual applause for our phenomenal storytellers. We basically handed them an impossible task of telling profoundly complex stories with tons of history embedded in them in like 5 minutes, and they stood to the task. So thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm seeing folks beginning to type some questions into the chat box. We welcome your questions. We're going to skip back to some of the thoughts on divide and conquer more broadly, so that we'll have some time for people's questions to the panelists to trickle in, and then we'll return to our storytellers and have some dialogue with them. How does that sound to you, storytellers? Thank you. Awesome. So there are some who would rightly say that the conditions were challenging before Trump was elected and that they are still challenging now. But our experience as organizers, as trainers, is that conditions have actually gotten much more painful for frontline communities since Donald Trump took the presidency. Trump ran a campaign that was rooted in and reliant upon white supremacy, misogyny, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and he won. We learned something really hard about our neighbors that day. Exit polls showed that 58% of white voters, ranging across class, educational background, and gender, elected Trump. Several decades of neoliberal economic policies have failed the vast majority of this nation's residents. And the Trump campaign capitalized on that dissatisfaction by supposedly offering something different. So you could say that like we're living in this moment that is a perfect example of divide and conquer. The majority of today's white voters were successfully convinced by the GOP that they had more in common with this bratty billionaire than with ordinary working class folks like them. And since then, we've really seen newly emboldened channels of violence and profoundly harmful legislation directed at immigrants, Muslims, women, queer folks, trans people, gender nonconforming people, indigenous communities, all people of color, poor and working class people, and the land that we stand on, the land that we live on, the stolen land that we inhabit. In real time, our communities are actively being pitted against each other. And so a really good example that's like alive right now for us is Trump's New Deal for Black America, which actually our comrades in BYP 100 have been doing some really good work to think through and understand and figure out how to confront. Trump's New Deal for Black America promises jobs and safety to Black Americans, but in packages that would be harmful to many of Black and brown neighbors. Privatization of schools, increased policing, tax breaks and lax laws for big corporations, increased war spending, and the turning of poverty assistance into microloans. I don't know about you, but my family would not have made it through if it weren't for what they call welfare. And what they're talking about is turning that into microloans that would really hurt families like yours and mine. Most blatantly, Trump is trying to blame immigrants and refugees for the ways that the US has exploited Black Americans. Trump's New Deal for Black America says, quote, "We will restore the civil rights of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and all Americans by ending illegal immigration. No group has been more economically harmed by decades of illegal immigration than low-income African American workers. Hillary's pledge to enact open borders made in secret to a foreign bank would destroy the African American working class. We will reform visa rules to give American workers preference for jobs, and we will suspend reckless refugee admissions from terror-prone regions that cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars." So we see the way that he's like totally criminalizing victims of war. "We will use a portion of the money saved by enforcing our laws and suspending refugees to reinvest in our inner cities." So here is that bribe that Toussaint so beautifully named earlier. It's like, here, we'll give you this thing if you'll harm these other people. And we know that our folks are not falling for that. Trump actually literally promises to gut climate change research and redirect those funds to repair the poisoned water systems of America's inner cities. What is he talking about? To prepare ourselves for this moment, we'll need to adapt our organizing, our advocacy, our education, our research, our healing, our cultural work strategies. We're going to need to figure out how to engage in both agitation and compassion at once, especially because most of us who are organizing in this moment are also processing our own personal and community traumas, and that really impacts our own defenses against divide and conquer strategies that are being employed against us. So it's super necessary that we care for each other at this time. We've got to remain anchored in our love for each other and for our collective liberation as we resist and challenge the brutal core of white supremacy and hatred that has been made plain in this political moment. Next.
I actually want to skip this for time, not because it isn't important, but because it's actually more important to hear more from folks. Can we just jump to the divide and conquer? Yeah, hi. Beautiful. Thank you. So we're having a fun time doing things in a fun mashup version today. I'm really into it. It's making my brain think in different ways. So I wanted to give you guys, I think it's great to hear all these big stories, and then we want to give some like really concrete definitions that can be helpful. And you'll be getting this also after the webinar in a handout version too. So you're going to be having that to share. So when we say divide and conquer, there's lots of stories we have. It's often hard to delineate and really like tease out what exactly this means. So the way that we define divide and conquer is that it's a strategy used by elites who are often understood as the oppressors. And these elites, I'm going to name this right now, can be people who are extreme right wing, and they have also often been the neoliberal center. And so it's really important to be able to be thinking about both the ways that someone like the Trump administration is trying to break folks apart, as well as how the neoliberal establishment, who really don't want broad-based movements, are going to also be playing with wedge issues to try to have us huddle to the center as if it will save us, when we actually know that it has never done that thing. So it's a strategy used by elites, who we often sometimes talk about as oppressors, to break down unity among subjugated, often racial groups of people who are struggling for justice, freedom, and liberation, and that they do this in order to maintain the status quo. So we can both understand that Trump would do this, right? Because, for instance, real estate speculation, really grounded on the dispossession of Black and brown neighborhoods, has worked really well for him as a tool. But also, right, we know that the Democratic Party has really also seen, even though it's really scrambling right now, there's also been some holding of that power in a way that they don't actually want Black Lives Matter's policy program to be the policy program of the DNC. But what a world that could be as well, right? So it's really about not pushing or stretching us. And so this big strategy has three main tactics. One, we've already heard a lot about these. One, creating a narrative that blames each group for the other group's problems, right? So in New Orleans after the storm, right, immigrant workers were brought in, Black folks were kept out of jobs, right? Telling Black folks that immigrants were job stealers, telling immigrants that Black people were lazy in order to totally mystify what was actually happening with like the Department of Labor under Bush at that time. So this works to obfuscate and to foster mistrust, obfuscate systematic inequalities of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, and to foster mistrust amongst groups who actually have a lot in common and have a lot of power to build together. So that's one tactic. Second tactic is bribing some groups, so here's that bribing piece, with access to some resources, material and psychological, right? And this works to align some groups with elite people over other subjugated groups. And the really key thing is the resources offered are never, ever close to the original goals of the movement, right? So people are getting some crumbs, they're never getting the full bread, right? And it's being told that, implicitly it's being told you can never have that bread to begin with, so why would you think that you could ask for more? Third one. So the third piece here is to threatening to withdraw resources and or to enact violence against other groups if they continue to ally with other subjugated groups, right? And that this creates a culture of fear that not only breaks down intergroup relationships, but also leads to groups being overall less bold and taking fewer risks in their pursuits of justice, freedom, and liberation. And when I say threatening to withdraw resources, I think it's really key to know that sometimes it actually happens, and often it's the threat is enough, right? And so people will, and you don't even know if the follow through is even possible at times. Often it is, but sometimes it might actually not even be politically viable to go through with the threat because of the backlash that could be received. But that able to either say, we're going to take away, for instance, your funding, you can't do that type of political work, or we're going to take away grants, for instance, in the nonprofit world, or to actually have state-sanctioned violence enacted on you so that you're quiet and you get small and you don't want to take risks, either for this issue right now and also as ripple effects for future movements as well. So those are some real quick, dirty definitions.
So here's a few questions that we're thinking about. As we heard our storytellers tell the stories, we're asking ourselves what potential divides were bridged. What tools, actions, or strategies did organizers use to bridge these divides and resist divide and conquer tactics? How can we use this historical moment of learning to build stronger movements for racial justice today? Here were a couple questions that were asked. I believe someone named John asked Toussaint, Oregon's and the 1850 Constitution has a core of white supremacy and leaves a residual modern tension between poor, rural, majority white populations, which vote conservative, and somewhat more diverse, educated, and liberal urban populations. Is it a defensible argument that the Bacon dynamics are at the root of this, despite the time and distance separation?
If I understand well, one, thank you for the question, and two, if I understand the question correctly, is whether or not we can really understand that history of Bacon's Rebellion helps, and kind of how some elements of it exist within the within Oregon's Constitution, can help us clarify some of the tensions between poor, rural, white populations in Oregon and kind of liberal urban populations. I think it's helpful in some sense, and I think it also helps to give us a way of thinking about the possibilities of, well, yeah, I want to say yes, basically, as an answer to the question. I could go in the,
and Toos, can I build on that by asking,
yeah,
so like when you were hearing Lydia tell the story, like did you see a thread between the Bacon's Rebellion story and what Lydia's describing happening in the struggle on the ground in New Orleans around prison shrinkage?
I mean, I think the difference is a little bit, it's a slightly different dynamic, but I think one of the things that is instructive about Bacon's Rebellion is that in some instances you had kind of white indentured servants and enslaved Africans kind of rallying around Bacon's banner, or in some instances going to support the colonial governor, mainly because they saw each of those, the promises of, freedom or greater access to land, and into their indentured period, or even being able to kind of loot the property of some of the kind of wealthy landowners in colonial Virginia as advantageous to them, right? So it's kind of really seeking opportunities to take advantage of a slightly different opportunity, in some sense kind of privilege, that was being offered in the midst of this conflict. And I think the thing that's slightly different about the circumstances with the Orleans Parish Prison case is that rather than relying on how elites define the circumstances and seeing maybe there's a better option here, a better option there, I think in that campaign did a fairly good job of defining what some people might call kind of a left pole, right? And saying like, this is the position that we want to work from, and using that pole as the basis around which to organize people, as opposed to saying, well, maybe if the demand is to create, an expanded jail, but one that has like a few more amenities or something along those lines, that's something that we can kind of go towards. So I think an important aspect of what was missing during Bacon's Rebellion was it was kind of a left pole that said, hey, what we're going to fight for is not necessarily how we can do a better job of exploiting, indigenous nations or something to that effect, and instead clearly defined a position of opposition that can then pull away, like not only rally the kind of 99% folks, right, but also pull away some of the supporters of those who are in opposition.
Yeah, that's a really useful lesson for this moment. Lydia, can you identify what some of the key elements were that kept the coalition together? Like, was there leadership of key individuals, specific conversations at key moments? Like, what kept the reformers from going to behind the scenes meetings and selling the coalition out?
Yeah. And, maybe people went to some behind the scenes meetings. I don't know that happened. Could have. If it did, it didn't work, which is maybe also great, right? I think we cannot underestimate. There were two groups that I think held leadership in some really profound ways. And one of them was critical resistance, and particularly Kai Lumumba Barrow, a very long time organizer. And the other was Norris Henderson, who is the executive director of Vote. And I think they both of them had learned through lots of organizing, these common missteps. So I think there's a way in which it's about like having already had this like trajectory of struggle, and people being willing to listen to that. Norris in particular, was formerly incarcerated wrongly at Angola for 27 and a half years, and really got his organizing chops from behind bars. And I think there is a way in which he has really deeply said, we were able to do a lot of things on the inside. This outside world stuff is actually going to be, it's hard. It's not as hard, right? Like he actually is like, I can do certain things that I was never able to do those years that we were collectively organizing on the inside, and that able to also have deep, through that organizing work is how North started organizing New Orleans with lots of folks who had been locked up in Angola and other prisons across the state. And I think having that really deep grounding, really, I think there's a principle there. Like, I think that both like Norris's principle of actually being able to say like, this is what this impact is doing to families, friends, we know them, we can talk about them, this isn't abstract, really was a grounding center. And Kai having such deep Black feminist abolitionist dreams, and being unwilling to budge because they actually knew people's lives were at stake. And I think that it was actually critical in that space, and also listening too, right? Like not saying it's my way or the highway, but saying this is why, and I want to hear what's going on. And so I think actually the work of really building together over a protracted amount of time really does something when folks are willing to stay at the table.
Thanks so much, y'all. Mark and Autumn, are there other questions you want to draw to the fore?
Yeah, there was a question for Lydia specifically around where were you seeing race and class divisions come up in this organizing?
Well, so I think this is notable. The race was much messier. like the race, there were people across, like if there was a much messier groups on throughout this political spectrum. I think we saw something really messy that came up, which is the sheriff in New Orleans, Marilyn Gusman, is the first Black sheriff ever. He got elected right before Katrina in 2004. And so there, what was outside was some Black elites rallying around Gusman as a Black elected official in the context of the intense assault on Black elected officials for corruption after Katrina that people really saw as a way to get white leadership in. So I think that what we actually saw was outside of this coalition, right, this other type of elite of like race, and when I say like Black elite, I mean like Black middle class folks in the city trying to get people to support Gusman, and people saying we actually don't, that is not a political viable move, right? And so, and actually an anti-racist politic makes us argue against Gusman's goals. And I think that was hard and really difficult, but really critical to be thinking of in that way. And I think the class stuff was more around the differences in the ideological spectrum was also really on the who had different access to resources in these organizations. And I think we can't forget the ways in which bigger nonprofits often have access to resources in a way that often starts to move them closer to the center, right, than some of these other more grassroots organizations. Not that that's always the case, but I think did play out in some ways on the ground relative of people's individual positions, but more in terms of like the organizational framing.
Beautiful. I'm going to jump in here because we have to move towards closing, and we have some final thoughts to leave you with. And actually, Eleanor raised this really interesting question that I think is a really good moment for us to sort of turn our gaze, which is what are some ways that we can ensure our movements don't replicate Native erasure and settler colonialism logic, especially for marginalized people ourselves? It's a really beautiful question. And so on that subject, we wanted to leave you with some closing thoughts. We had a whole bunch of beautiful questions that we were going to ask you while you beautiful pictures, and now I'm just going to scroll through the beautiful pictures without asking beautiful questions. We don't actually have time to move all of it. But just look at the beautiful faces of resistance. Oh my. We wanted to leave you with, in response to that question and to all of this content, we wanted to leave you with some closing thoughts about how do we actually topple the divide and conquer? Like, what do we actually do? Knowing that movements are constantly faced with these same issues and these same tactics. And there were five things that we wanted to lift up. One, the first is the importance of need for healing. Understanding that as a part of our movement work, we have to both demand reparations for past harm, as well as create intentional space and time for healing from the trauma that we're experiencing in an ongoing way. And that there's sort of there's a twin reparative process that has to happen. There's the reparations that's actually through the redistribution of resources that were stolen, but there's also the repair of relationships, and whether those relationships are between communities or whether they're between individuals, that there's a need for repair and a need for healing that has to be centered in the way that we do our work. We also have this piece in here about practicing consent, that we know that a huge part of how divide and conquer works is through a lack of consent, right? And that either a lack of consent or offering consent because it feels like there's no other option. And so what we want to do is think about centering practicing good consent in our movement spaces. The second piece we wanted to lift up is the importance of sparking and sustaining internal transformation. When we say internal, we mean both internal personal transformation as well as organizational transformation. And so that means different things for different folks in terms of where you're positioned within these movement spaces. It means that for people who have access to power, access to resources, access to influence, you have to learn to honor the leadership of people who have historically been denied power. But it means for those of us who have historically denied power have to be at a practice of self-nation, and for that self-determination that enables us to determine our own destinies means being able to work in unity with each other. And so these are practices that require internal transformation of both our thought processes and our narratives and the stories that we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about our communities, the stories that we tell about our movements. What's possible and what's not possible. We have to be able to imagine new possibilities. The third piece we wanted to lift up is the important respond at the needed speed, as opposed to the speed that we typically work at. So some of us, that means willing to slow down, right? We know that we are in a state of crisis, but we don't actually have to move at the pace of emergency. And often moving at the pace of emergency is how divide and conquer tactics most effective used against our movements, when we're moving so fast that we actually have no space to reflect on what's happening. We have no space to even interrogate where a request might be coming from or what's motivating it. So we have to be willing to slow down, but and again, twinning of these practices, that we also have to be willing to be flexible and agile, because we might actually have to rapidly change tactics or quickly forge alliances to meet the needs of a given moment. So we have to be willing to be slow, but we also have to be willing to respond and to be called. And that requires, again, in terms of that previous slide around internal transformation, it also requires all of us being willing to be in a practice of followership. And that can be in some ways most challenging for our movements, because most of our movements are existing in spaces where we've often been acculturated into a high level of individualism. And that makes it very difficult to operate as followers in spaces, or as both leaders and followers. The lift up is that we need to practice being. One of the things we've been talking about a lot, Yorda, is the fact that we have to understand some of our movement losses, that they are in relationship to movement wins. And we're actually going to be talking about this a lot more in the next webinar, that understanding that this political moment and the loss that we've experienced in the last few months is actually in direct relationship to a series of really significant social movement wins. So we have to understand that this is happening because we are powerful, not because we lack power. And so what are we then called to do? We need to build institutions that replace the ones that don't work for us and that we are simultaneously targeting in our organizing campaigns. We need to build alternative institutions that actually give us spaces to practice cooperation, to practice liberatory governance, to build that solidarity economy that enables us to actually shift into the world that we want to be in. We know that we can't just flip from this world to the next one, right? So one of the ways we think about it is we need pathways to liberation through practice. So we need to build those alternative institutions that give us space to practice being liberated and being free. And the fifth piece we wanted to lift up is we need to coordinate like we want to win. We need to coordinate like we want to win the world. And that means that we have to refuse to participate in turf battles and in just general pettiness. Not that a shade can't happen every now and then. We can avoid being. We need to be willing to share everything. We need to be able to build authentic alliances. And that happens both through shared agreements at the outset about what the work is going to be, but also through a practice of radical honesty throughout the alliance work, right? Just because we're in alliance doesn't mean you have to be nice to each other all the time. Sometimes we actually have to speak hard truths to each other. We have to be able to hear that and receive it. And one of the last pieces we want to note is that we have to recognize that dismantling these systems requires us to give up our attachment to some of the systems, especially the ones that, for depending on different parts of our identity, they maybe have enabled our survival up until now. But maybe if they're enabling our survival and only that and nothing beyond, then we have to be willing to detach from those systems. And that requires a real significant shift in how we think about what's possible, again. So we're leaving you with some closing thoughts, closing questions. There's these two thoughts that we wanted to sort of uplift as you consider coming into the next webinar. How does the reconfiguration primacy that we've been talking about current work? And then how do we lift the lessons from the past and recent history to resist the system's divide and conquer tactics? Please put in your mind as we move forward through the month and into the next part. You as a part of the emails that you received a reflection and discussion guide that has a whole bunch of juicy questions and things to think about around the content that we just presented. And we encourage you to be working with that both with yourself just internally, but also with other folks that you're working locally with. And we really, really want to encourage you to show up for the next webinar. It's happening at the same time on April 27th, Thursday, April 27th. And again, the theme of that next webinar is understanding this political moment. And we're going to be doing a lot of in that webinar that's around actually looking at how does movement building happen, and how do we know where we are in this movement moment? How do we sort of assess and understand, like, what is this part of the movement building process that we're in, and how do we understand, based on where we are in this movement moment, what are the strategies that are going to actually work most well for this moment, and how do we actually align around those strategies? So that's where we're going next. It's about to be so amazing. Oh my gosh, there's music playing.
And everyone will get you will gain emails, including the recordings. So check it out.
Exactly. Thank you so much, all of our panelists, to all of you who came. If you're so excited about what you heard, put an exclamation point into the chat box. Just like exclamation point, heart. We love you. We're so glad you showed up for this. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Koya. Thank you, Manju. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lydia. So much gratitude. And we'll see you next time.